Good evening and welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host, Bill Wolford. Israel is beside itself. It is orchestrating fever-pitch propaganda against Iran. Economic sanctions, now attempted, will not work, and Israel is hell-bent against a nuclear Iran. Will Israel plunge America into another no-win conflict, this time with Iran? What unfolds should Israel recklessly bomb Iran? Disaster, warns my guest Richard Silverstein. We discuss tonight Israel, Iran, and disaster. Richard Silverstein is founder of Tikkun Olam, an Israel-Palestine peace blog. Richard has contributed articles to The Guardian, Al Jazeera English, and Seattle Times. It is a pleasure to welcome returning guest Richard Silverstein to Moral Politics. Richard, you spread an alarm recently in a blog. Would bombing of Iran by Israel bring disaster to America?
I think that it would bring disaster to the region, it would bring disaster to Israel, and it would bring disaster indirectly to the U.S. as well. You may recall that General Petraeus testified before Congress a week or so ago, and he raised the Israel-Palestine conflict as a real sore point in the Arab world that is actually causing the loss of American troops, that the anger and hostility that the Arab street feels towards the U.S. because of the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict is hurting the U.S.
That's powerful, and you know, it's so overdue to have a man of that caliber finally delve into what is so obvious, I think, to so many people for so long. Do you think they'll listen to it?
I think that when America's leading general says it, it takes it into a different dimension. It's different than if you say it or I say it. We don't have stripes on our, or we're not wearing a uniform. Don't have all those medals. So yes, I think it has a lot more credibility coming from a military officer. And it was taken up by Vice President Biden, who's also a very important figure, who's always been known as being pro-Israel. And for him to start talking this way means that there is a sea change happening.
But yet that contrasts with the media tenor today. You know, we just had the AIPAC conference, and if anything, you would think it was a war council to get Iran.
Yeah, and I noticed that Nancy Pelosi came out of the AIPAC meeting and met with Bibi Netanyahu and John Boehner, and they had basically a love fest. And she was the one who used that rhetoric of saying there's no daylight between Israel and the United States. We're all one. One big happy family. And I think that Pelosi realizes that there are very serious issues that divide the U.S. and Israel. But I think she's thinking about the November elections, and she doesn't want to come across as being soft on...
But still, she gives away that kind of language, almost like a promissory note, without qualifier. In other words, Israel, go do whatever you want. We've told you that we'll stick with you.
It's absolutely shameful, and Bibi plays on that. If he ever has a problem with a president, and he did it with Bill Clinton, and he's trying it with Barack Obama, he tries to go appeal over the head of the president to the American people, to the Congress, and he says, the Congress is the one that gives me my weapons and gives me my $3 billion every year, and I only need their support, and I'm going to play off the president against the Congress.
But is the lobby, is Israel able to affect American elections to such an extent? Are we captured by Israel that our politicians have to cite language like no daylight, enduring bonds, and not pay attention, not qualify it, and say you've got to be a moral nation, not a criminal nation?
More money is the mother's milk of politics, as Jesse Unruh said. And AIPAC and its donors have a lot of money, and they're willing to freely spend on these congressional and presidential elections. And so, yes, they have a huge sway. I don't want to be confused and have people think that I'm saying that AIPAC and the Israel lobby have complete, utter control, like a robotic control over Israel policy. They don't. It's a struggle for them as it is for the peace lobby, which I support. But they have much, much more power than the peace lobby.
Maybe like their business is too big to fail, there are basically lobbies too endowed financially to really go on. Certainly AIPAC being an unregistered agent of a foreign power, at least we should register them, and maybe we could track where that money is coming from.
Yeah, AIPAC is extremely powerful. But I think even with all the money, I think that the logic of their position is undermined, and Israel is helping by being so intransigent. That no amount of money is going to overwhelm the fact that Israel's policy is bad for Israel and bad for the United States. And so,
But still, they can shut down diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran. We may actually, if I'm reading your warning correct, be going indirectly to war against Iran because of wrongheadedness by Israel.
yeah, yeah. When the Israelis sound the trumpet of war, Bibi and his generals sound the trumpet of war, it really resonates in the United States. And it's really hard to stop that train when it's going down the track as fast as it is.
Even though it's just so obvious that they've confused this whole issue of nuclear power and nuclear weapon.
Well, and they've also confused history by talking about Iran as if it's, Ahmadinejad as if he's Hitler, and Tehran as Munich, and it's 2010, but it's really 1938. You hear that kind of rhetoric over and over and over again, and it's designed to confuse people and to make you think that, to make you frightened, to bring up the term Nazi, that Iranians are Nazis and that Iran is a suicide nation. Alan Dershowitz just used that term this week. It's all utter, in Yiddish they use the term dreck. It's really garbage, pure garbage.
Well, how about these sanctions that are being, put together, orchestrated by the Jewish lobby for Israel? Is that a ruse?
Well, I think that the Israel lobby and the Obama administration, I have to say they're a willing participant in this, are proposing these punishing sanctions against Iran, and I think that they know that they won't work.
I mean, history tells us that clearly, doesn't it?
Yeah, except for in South Africa, which is a different set of circumstances and where it worked. But in no other country. We tried to have sanctions against Russia when they invaded Afghanistan. It didn't work. You look at any number of situations, it doesn't work.
And speaking of Russia and speaking of China, those are major trading partners with Iran. They probably are going to be very reluctant to go along with an Israel-sponsored sanction program.
Yeah. You hear differing stories every day. It's a different one, but I think ultimately China and Russia will be very reluctant to go along with sanctions against Iran. And even if they did, I just really don't see how it's going to work.
One thing that's got me worried, and it made your article so timely and also a real concern, is that there was an article about bunker busters being forward deployed to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, certainly in position to be used against Iran.
I think that is designed to elicit some kind of response from the Iranians, to frighten them, to maybe get them to be more pragmatic possibly, or to just see what they would do or how they would react. But what concerns me as much or more, personally I don't believe the United States is going to bomb Iran. What I'm concerned about is that Israel might do that, because Israel is much more willing to do something like that than the Obama administration. So those bunker busters that are sitting in the Indian Ocean now could be transferred to Israel. And the United States gave Israel a bunker buster, which it used to try to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah during the Lebanon War, and it failed. So we have to remember that even if Israel gets those bunker busters and does use them, it may not succeed in wiping out the Iranian nuclear program.
But it would make us complicit, though.
Oh yes, definitely. And what we have to keep in mind, and I know we're going to talk about this war game scenario, which is so chilling, but what we have to keep in mind is that we will be seen as a willing participant and accomplice by the Iranians and by Iran's allies, and so we can expect blowback, both possibly in the United States and possibly against our troops overseas, maybe against Jewish targets here or in other countries.
You kicked all of this off, at least it caught my attention. Citing an article in Israel, I believe, by Bernia, who's citing a war game planner, Vered. You want to tell me about that?
Sure. Israel's leading columnist is Nachum Barnea, and he got a hold of a report that was written by an Israeli academic named Moshe Vered, and he did a war game scenario about an Israeli-Iranian war. And he said, he asked a bunch of different questions. How would such a war start? What would each side have to do in order to get to the point where they would go to war? Once they did decide to go to war, what weapons would they use? What kind of casualties would there be? What kind of impact would it have on the economy of both nations? How long would the war last? And what kind of blowback would there be for people outside the region, for the United States?
I'm willing to venture here that none of these scenarios are anything but grim.
Yeah, he does not see any light for Israel in this kind of scenario. He paints a kind of picture where, we saw in the Lebanon war against Hezbollah that northern Israel was basically a ghost town. And so he's saying that what would happen is that basically all of Israel would turn into a ghost town. That Iranian missiles and the weapons of Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Syrians, would really create a state of terror in Israel.
All of those missiles are within reach of Israel population centers, aren't they?
Yeah. Hezbollah now has longer range missiles than they even had in the last war. Iran's missiles could reach virtually all of Israel, and even Hamas, if they wanted to, could have an impact in southern Israel.
And this is what I think Vera dubbed the light scenario.
He said that the initial attack would possibly be short, with Israel bombing nuclear program and then nuclear facilities, and then Iran counterattacking with missiles. Because Iran has a limited number of missiles and they're very expensive, that would be short, and then there would be a lull. But he says that would just be a lull. It would just be the beginning, and what would come after would pale in face of what the initial attack was.
And this is where the proxies come in, and it's just ongoing.
Right. He paints a picture of Israel possibly having to occupy Lebanon in order to stop Hezbollah from attacking. Paints a picture of Iranian troops going through Syria to get to the front, and possibly even going through Turkey if Turkey is willing to cooperate, and a united front against Israel involving Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and Hamas. It's kind of like a disaster scenario for Israel, because if Israel's enemies ever united and fought all together against Israel, it could be a disaster, because the IDF is not the fearsome warrior force that it's always been in its history. It's proven vulnerable in the last two wars that it fought. And Israel does not have a guarantee that it can wield that kind of fear and terror on its enemies as it did in the past.
So it'll have its back against the wall. Its IDF can't stay mobilized. Certainly biological, chemical, nuclear weapons would be pondered. Now, there's another scenario that Vera cites, and I think he calls that the soft scenario.
Well, there's one part of his scenario is that Iran would go on a counterattack, not a military counterattack, but it would attempt to use diplomatic means to fight against the Israeli attack. It would go to the UN. It would try to persuade the United States to
restraining itself the whole while and bringing censure against Israel.
Right, and it would try to go to the United States and say Israel's attacked us and it's the aggressor state. Go to the UN, the Security Council, and say we want you to sanction Israel, we want you to stop military weapons and spare parts going to Israel. Even if the United States vetoes these kinds of resolutions, it will be seen as the intransigent one, and it will not make the United States look good in the light of such aggression.
It might give some impetus to the BDS movement or a defund Israel.
Yeah, the way that Israel's policy has been working, just about everything it does gives impetus to BDS, I'm sorry to say.
You know, when you think about these scenarios in isolation, there's always the unknown. I think, as Rumsfeld would have said, you've got known knowns and unknown knowns and known unknowns, and however it goes. But when you're talking about war, this probably really applies. We can get into some mix and match of those various scenarios. Like a hard scenario, what about Israel with its back against the wall resorting to nuclear weaponry?
I don't think that Vera talks about that, but of course that's in the back of everybody's mind. And Israel would clearly, if it felt it was under any kind of threat, a serious threat, it would be willing to use nuclear weapons. There's no question about it.
It's very consistent with its Jabotinsky Zionist, announced policies.
Yeah. The policy is that, if you decide that you can hit us, we will hit you back with 10 times the force, and we will obliterate you.
That's the Iron Wall, Jabotinsky Zionist dictate.
Right. I don't personally think that it works in the Middle East anymore, especially with nuclear weapons, but that doesn't mean that people don't believe it.
The world is going to change, it seems. I mean, this is why you put out the warning. It looks like Israel is going to go through this sequence of sanction rouge. It's not going to work. They're going to have to do something militarily, and then all hell is going to break loose. You can't control it once you go militarily. because Iran is a very potent power to be messing with. And as you mentioned, the lessons of the Iraq-Iran war show that probably you're not going to get those mullahs to change for their policy by hitting them.
No, I think that what this is telling us is, and this is why I write my blog, is to mobilize public support here in the United States, push the Obama administration to maintain a pragmatic and realistic approach to Iran and not to fall sway to the siren song that Israel is playing of military forces being a way to resolve this, because military force will, I keep saying it over and over again like a broken record, but it will be a disaster. There's no question about it.
And it's a disaster for Americans, and it's about to come.
It would be a disaster. Some things that I didn't talk about yet, we should also keep in mind, and that is that Iran and its proxies around the world would be willing to engage in terror attacks against American targets, against Israeli targets, against Jewish targets. We could have synagogues bombed here and in other countries. And we could have assassinations of Israeli leaders, Israeli military officers.
And there's really no security countermeasures that are possible, and just think of the economics of even attempting.
Yeah,
security.
Well, Israel would, like you to believe that its security is impeccable and impregnable, but, we've seen today that anybody who has a strong enough will to do something can probably carry it out. We've seen in American history that people have been able to kill presidents. So,
well, just to make this a little more graphic, I mean, the Straits of Hormuz, our Navy is not going to be able to protect those shipping lanes indefinitely if we've got a really animated Middle East. It wouldn't just be Iran. It would be Iraq. It would be Afghanistan. It would be Pakistan.
We've got to think
Egypt, Saudi Arabia.
We've got to think of all that oil that goes through those straits, not only Iranian oil. We've got to think about Saudi Arabian oil. We've got to think about the world economy and the cost of oil. And
speaking of that, people don't realize how dependent our agricultural industry is on oil. If we are out of oil, we are out of food.
We're out of food because all of our farming equipment runs on gasoline and oil. And once our farmers are paying double and triple the cost of their gasoline for their equipment, they shut down the equipment because they can't make a profit.
Well, Stiglitz, the economist, said that the cost of the American campaigns that had a lot of neocon contribution to getting started in Iraq and Afghanistan will total probably $3 trillion. It's probably even higher now, since he's made that prediction. But what you're warning about is staggering. There probably isn't enough money to even make it economically sensible to be talking about all hell breaking loose.
I think if we looked at the economic collapse that we've seen over the last year or two, I think we're talking about, I don't know if I would say collapse, but we're talking about a man-made catastrophe, not just a military catastrophe, but a potential economic catastrophe as well, because this will not just affect the Middle East. This will affect the economies of all the major countries in the world. It's one of the reasons why China is so nervous about the idea of sanctions and what could come after, because their economy is booming right now, and it relies to a large extent on Iranian oil.
And American trade, which would probably end as well.
Yeah.
And then we get into what the economists call autarky, where you have little trading blocks with a lot of militarism, going back to gunboat diplomacy probably. Let's talk about Israel as an ally. Do you think it makes the cut as being an American ally?
I think that there's a real misnomer among the Jewish neocons that we've talked about, the Israel lobby, and that is they put forward this idea that Israel's interests and the United States' interests are the same. They talk about Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, which is not accurate, but they talk about Israel and the United States being democracies and freedom, and our histories being so linked together. And people joke among American Jews, they joke about Israel being the 51st state. But that's really a very, very deceptive and dangerous attitude to have, because Israel is a separate country and the United States is a separate country. We may have overlap of our interests, but our interests not only aren't the same, but they shouldn't be the same.
You see that so clearly. Why doesn't mainstream media report that way? Why are they reporting no daylight nonsense rhetoric from our intimidated elected leaders?
Because they hear it from the powers that be in the Israel lobby that have the ear of the media. They have the funds to take out the ads and to write the books and to go on the TV shows, and they have the pundits, that talk on CNN and all these outlets and Fox News, and they put out that message. And the media is either too lazy or too ignorant to ferret out voices like me and my blog and the other Jewish progressive bloggers that are putting out a different message. And we're saying that Israel has different interests than the United States, and that we must recognize that, and we must be willing to separate ourselves from Israel. And if Israel is saying we want you to go down this garden path towards bombing Tehran and bombing nuclear facilities, we have to say no. That's not in the United States' interest. And not only will we not do it ourselves, we won't let you do it.
So not only are we not going to give them the green light, we're going to give them a flashing red light if they should transgress. We might hold them to some international law.
Right. They say that during the Bush administration, when Olmert came to Washington, he asked for a green light, and Bush gave him a red light. And that's what we need to do. We need to shut them down, and we need to tell them that they will pay a price, not just pay a price in and of itself from Iranian blowback, but they will pay a price in an alienation of the affections of the U.S. government and U.S. people.
But Israel just might go it alone. Aren't they operating as a hegemon and operating with their own prerogative in that region?
They can't go it alone. If the United States has, I'm thinking of a four-letter word I shouldn't use on TV, but if we have that kind of sturdiness of purpose and faith in our principles, they will not be able to withstand that. I'm convinced that if Barack Obama got on the phone to Bibi Netanyahu and he said, Bibi, we're going to withhold the $3 billion. Remember what George Bush did to Yitzhak Shamir in 1992? Think about that in spades.
But Obama's not able to curb the latest round of settlements in Jerusalem.
Well, I'm hoping that he got a little backbone, because I understand Bibi's trip was not a happy one, his last one in the United States in Washington, and that he and Biden and Hillary Clinton really gave him an earful, and he went back to Israel very, very unhappy. So I'm dubious a lot of the times about Obama and whether he has the spine to do it, but I was very pleased about what happened in Washington. And I think that I think that Iran is even more in our interest to stop than stopping housing and settlement construction in East Jerusalem.
But we look at Gaza and the devastation there, and America came after the fact, probably before the fact. We were supporting them. Do you think that maybe the Israelis will just go break things, and then America will put its umbrella of defense over Israel, despite them being in violation of international and domestic and all sorts of UN conventions?
My hope is that even if Barack Obama shows a sort of spinelessness and isn't willing to stand up to Israel, that the weight of all of the violations that Israel has engaged in, of international law, of human rights, the killings of unarmed civilian Palestinians, that all of those things will eventually cause Israel's position to fall like a house of cards. That's why the Goldstone report has resonated so strongly. It's why the idea of bringing Israeli generals and politicians on arrest warrants before international courts of justice. It's why BDS is resonating more and more. The worse Israel's positions are, the more draconian, the more militaristic they are, the more those alternatives resonate. So I have faith that historically the Obama administration, even if it has to be dragged along by those things, that it will, and eventually there will be justice.
But one of the big elephants sitting in the room is that the AIPAC has been a force for American disaster. If we conclude that it is a war council, that it can bring politicians to their knees and make them genuflect and give obeisance and use this, enduring bonds of friendship without qualifiers on Israel. What do you What's your assessment of these people in AIPAC that are Americans? I'm not talking about Israelis that are partaking. You'd expect them to, speak for their country, but Americans that participate so strenuously in AIPAC that are about to bring ruin to America.
These people are terribly deluded. They sincerely and honestly do believe that Israel and U.S. interests should be the same. That if Israel...
But that won't pass the reasonable man test, would it?
They're not reasonable. That's the problem. But I think that there are enough other people outside of AIPAC, even in the American Jewish community, that are reasonable. It's one of the reasons why I'm so sympathetic to groups like J Street, which we've talked about on your program before. J Street acts as a counterweight to AIPAC and becomes stronger and stronger by the day. And the only way to fight back against AIPAC is by having groups like J Street become stronger, supporting candidates, telling them that we'll give you money if you are willing to have a pragmatic and principled position about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's what AIPAC does, and that's the game that the progressives have to play as well.
So the AIPACers, who are Americans, should be working to make Israel a real partner for peace, which it has never been.
I think that AIPAC would be much better off as an organization if it was pragmatic. I mean, as people say that AIPAC advances Israel's agenda, that's not even true. Sometimes AIPAC's positions don't even agree with the Israeli government. They're more right-wing than the Israeli government. So AIPAC goes far beyond the positions that it would need to advance in order to further Israel's agenda. And that's the kind of outrageousness that we need to fight against.
I don't even want to think about the world that we would live in should Israel strike Iran. And I hope that viewers share the worry. And I want to thank you again, Richard, for daring. I know the pressure you received, daring to write an alarm and to write about righteousness, really. And let us hope that people will listen to you and listen to General Petraeus warning that it's the conflict in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine, and it's this hegemonic mindset that is taking us right to the ledge. Thank you, Richard Silverstein.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate having me.